So very nice crowd. We're very pleased to see all of you, and we may still get a few more logging in, but to be true to our time, let's get started. So welcome to our webinar, Risk Management in a Changing Environment. So this is our first webinar in our new risk webinar series. These are content webinars, and the subject, as you would guess it, is risk, and it's risk in a changing environment, which is very, very interesting. So I'm Carmen Rossiter. I'm the Program Director for the Center in Governance, Risk Management, and Control Excellence at the Schulich Executive Education Center. We also have a risk program at the university, the Master's Certificate in Risk Management and Business Performance Management. We're in our 10th year, so this is very, very exciting. Past year plus, we've been 100% virtual and still very, very good. But today is our first webinar. We are joined by Carol-Ann Northcott from, she's the Chief Risk Officer at Bank of Canada. So we're delighted to have Carol-Ann as our inaugural speaker in our first webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol-Ann in a moment so she can briefly introduce herself, and then I'll ask her a few questions, and pretty early on then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. That's you. And before I turn it over to Carol-Ann, I just want to note that Carol-Ann is a graduate from our program. She graduated in January 2015. I can't believe it's been over 6 years, like definitely an action-packed 6 years, especially the past few years. So Carol-Ann, on to you. Give us a brief introduction, and I'm going to start shooting questions at you.
Okay, and I was told to keep it brief. So Carol-Ann Northcott, I'm the Chief Risk Officer at the Bank of Canada. And kind of before I get underway though, I do just want to acknowledge that today is the National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. And I think as we're going to start talking about, we're going to hear about this a lot from me about diversity of ideas and how important that is. I just wanted to kind of settle in today just to acknowledge that this is a really important day, especially what's going on. So I've been a CRO at the Bank of Canada for 4 years, and 3 years before that at an organization called Payments Canada. And I did have my first introduction to enterprise risk really at Schulich. And so as we kind of go through today, I'm really happy to share how that's been part of my journey. And I'll tell a bit more about my journey as I go on, but I was told to keep it super short. So for now, I'm Carol-Ann and I'm a CRO, and we can build on that as we go along.
Okay, and I know Carol-Ann will tell us more of her story as she answers all these various questions. She's going to pepper it in as we go along. So let's jump right in. So we're in the midst of a crisis, really action-packed time. And thinking of the context of today, from your perspective, at Bank of Canada, Chief Risk Officer, what's going on right now? And also, before we go too far, I'm sure you're going to want to give us a disclaimer. Right. So let's just do it. Okay.
Everything I say is from me and has absolutely no bearing on the Bank of Canada. We're talking only from, you have me, you have Carol-Ann Northcott. You do not have the Bank of Canada. And thank you for reminding me, Carmen.
That's who we want. That's definitely who we want. So we're in the midst of a crisis. Here we are today. What's going on right now in terms of risk? What do you see?
So if I'm gonna, I'll start kind of big picture maybe, and just say what's going on in the world. For me, the pandemic obviously has to be at the forefront of our minds. And I think what's really exciting from a risk perspective is a couple big buckets that this means for risk management. One, we're going to go strategy, culture, and then I'm going to talk about operational risk, if these are things that are really hitting me. From a strategy perspective, with the pandemic, there are a lot of transitional changes. There could also be structural changes. And so there is a lot going on right now for us to really understand how this could impact our future business and strategic outlook. So strategic risk, really very exciting. And Carmen, I'll just kind of touch on each of these, but I'm happy to go into detail on any of them, right? The other big thing is around in this pandemic space, culture with these new ways of working. And there's some really big pieces to this. There's things around mental health, because we're going through a pandemic and we have this really interesting dynamic of, in some cases, being overloaded, too much to do, but in other cases, nothing. And that has its own stresses and anxieties, and it has obliterated for many the divide between work and home and those boundaries. And what does that mean? There's a whole world here on employee expectations and skills. And that's really interesting from an HR perspective, because as we have moved through the pandemic, what are employees going to want and what are employers going to need from a skills perspective? So there's another big set of risks. And the other big set of risks I see here in this culture is around risk and innovation. So what is the right culture? What does the culture need to be to support risk and innovation? And how does this new transition into probably more working from home going to affect that culture to really enable it? And I think hopefully, Carmen, will have a few more chances to talk about that culture, but that's a huge risk as well. And so strategy, culture, and then operational risks, because what's really interesting about the pandemic, I mean, these things were already happening, everything I've already talked about, but the pandemic kind of moved things forward. Things, the digitization, operational risks like cyber, which is right on the forefront, but now with more people working from home, it just makes it that much more important. And third-party risks is another place where, from an operational risk perspective, it's obsessing me quite a bit. So when I kind of think about the current environment, those are the range of risks that really, really have me fixated right now. And I'm happy to, Carmen, you're going to direct me as to how far we want to go on any of these.
Yeah, no, but those are the big three. Definitely agree with you. And strategy, I mean, strategy's always been important to organizations, but now more than ever with all the change, if you haven't refreshed or revised your strategy, you need to be asking yourself why. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about strategy, and I know that ties into risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's exciting about this is, so if risk is, the definition of risk is the uncertainty around future events, then we kind of have that in spades, right? I mean, the world is always evolving, but these things take time. The world was digitizing, the world was doing more remote work. There were some of these cultural influences that were already happening, but the pandemic kind of fast forwarded really quickly. And that shift that may have taken years to still happen kind of came on us within 6 months to 8 months. And so you really have to move quickly. And I think it's really hard right now. People always say things like never make big life changes in the middle of, a personal crisis. But that's kind of what we're doing right now, in the sense that we're in this pandemic. We are still fully in it, but it has changed in many ways. Structurally, what's going to happen going forward. So if you're not thinking strategically and positioning yourself now, you're going to miss the boat. But then you're going to have to step out and take some risk to do that. And you might make the wrong decision, right? You might go in the wrong direction. So I do think from a strategy perspective, this pandemic really pulled things forward and made change happen more quickly. I don't know that it's really different, to be honest. Like when I think about the things I'm worried about, whether it's on even the culture side, things like overcapacity and workload and stress, and burnout. I think we are hearing about that a lot. I was hearing about that a lot in my discussions with CROs before the pandemic, and this just makes it worse. I heard a lot about creating the right culture for risk and innovation before the pandemic, and now I'm hearing about it more. Operational risk, the cyber, the third party, all these things were being talked about before the crisis, but now it's really hitting hard. So it's kind of brought stuff forward. So from a strategy perspective, you really need that risk mindset of being able to look out and see trends and really understand where are there opportunities and where are the pitfalls. And if you need to move on this, you just can't sit and wait. because then you will have missed it. So I think it's a really interesting time where risk and strategy have to really be working well together.
And then maybe another question. So that's the now. So that's the context of today. But maybe looking forward to issues for the future. And then you said it yourself. You know, risk is about future uncertainty. So what does the future look like? What do you see in your crystal ball
For future risks? Well, maybe I'll just talk a bit more about the culture. So the challenges that are coming out of the pandemic.
Yes.
For culture. So, you know, for me, risk and innovation are really two sides of the same coin. You can't have one truly without the other. And the kinds of culture one needs to enable both are the same. It's about diversity of ideas. It's about debate and dialogue. It's about practicing and exercising things and learning from your mistakes. And it's about often collaborating. And what I'm finding is really interesting about this world with so many people working from home. I'll tell you the challenges I'm facing is how do you enable that kind of an environment in a work from home sense? It's in some ways brilliant, right? Because I think the people who love it, they love it because they can put their heads down and they can get a lot of work done. They're excited about the productivity, right? Head down, go for it. Which is wonderful. But the flip side of that is it's much harder to collaborate. It's much harder to really get a sense of what's going on in the organization, to see where there are issues starting to bubble up. And there's a little bit of out of sight, out of mind, right? So if you're not seeing people, are you asking the right questions? Are you being asked into the conversation? And so from a risk culture perspective, you know, if you don't have good governance set up that enables and requires risk to be brought into the conversation, you know, there could be some real challenges with staying involved in the conversation and being in the know, but then also being able to influence. I spend a lot of my time, I think about how do I influence? When am I the most influential? It's in those bilateral conversations, often in the margins of meetings where you get a good read on people and then you can track things down. It's really hard in a virtual world. And I could just say we're going to hold our breath and eventually we'll be all back to work and all that'll be sorted out. But it won't be actually, because many of us will be working from home permanently or in some sort of hybrid way. So there has to be new ways to influence, new ways to enable that collaboration, diversity of ideas. And I think that's going to be the hardest cultural piece for risk management to kind of shift through. Other things are going to be great. With the shift to digital, that enables more infrastructure, enables more data, and enables more analytics perhaps, but that being able to connect and understand what the issues are and to be able to influence, it's going to take a lot more, it's going to take a lot more work. So that's on the culture side. And I think the on the maybe the hard risk side, because we're going to see a continuation of more being done online, more digital, it just ups the game on the cyber side, and it ups the game on the third party risk management side, because we really need to be able to manage those risks effectively, and it's quite challenging. So I mean, I'm kind of repeating a little bit, but
no, very good. And you said that the bilateral discussions were the, you know, where you got the most tractions. But maybe to ask you as a CRO, how does your knowledge of risk give you a seat at the table? If it and does it give you a seat at the table? And if not, how do you gain that seat?
yeah, so I know there's maybe, I think I may have thought this way when I was younger. It's hard to remember, but there's a sense that you know, you're going to be invited in. You got this title, risk manager, and you're going to be invited in, and it's going to be a wonderful thing, and people will be thankful for my brilliance. I think there's two things you need to be at the table, right? You need a governance structure that requires it, and you need to be able to influence. And you need both, actually, if you want to have a seat at the table, especially during crisis times. You need the governance structure because people make decisions. Decision makers make decisions. This is what they do. This is why they got the job they've got, whether they're a CRO, a COO, whether they're a boss, any sort in the organization, they like to make decisions. And so unless there is a really clear mechanism that says, oh, by the way, before you make this decision, you should touch base with this kind of a risk framework, it can be hard to remember to touch base with the right people. So you need a governance structure that really enables it, but also rewards it and has all that in there. But even if you have that, you have to show up at the table with the skills as a risk manager to be able to actually add value. And this is the influence part. You need to be able to really bring that value. And for me, what that value is being able to understand what the business needs is trying to achieve. And sometimes it's helping them understand what they need to achieve, because sometimes that's actually the kicker. They don't actually understand what they need to achieve. And then helping and working with people to find the ways to achieve it within their risk appetite and bringing that real strategic value. So you can be required to be at the table, but if you don't bring strategic value, you're not going to have influence. They can want to have you at the table, but they don't have the governance. They might forget to bring you because they're making decisions too quickly. So these two things really, really have to go together. You need both. You need the governance and you need the ability to influence and provide value.
No, very good. And maybe I'll just take it on that thread. So we're a university. We're big on knowledge and learning. So you talked about what you need to get a seat at the table and keep a seat at the table. But what about into the future? So what risk skills do you think we need going into the future? Is it maybe more of the same, or just a fine tuning it, or what do you see in your crystal ball?
So there's kind of two different levels that I'll kind of speak to, and maybe part of it is also a career journey kind of example. So there's a piece that's about analytics. So as a risk manager, there's a part about understanding objectively risk data. So skills around data analytics. Sometimes in some areas we have too much data. How do you make meaning of that? In some areas we don't have any data. How do you do something without that? So making that meaning with risk metrics and models and very technical kind of risk skills, which are going to, of course, be important. And they become more challenging in a world where you're inundated with data, right? But then the other piece of this puzzle is about, to be a really strategic senior risk manager, it's always about strategy. It's about being able to make sense of all that stuff, being able to see through the details, to look forward, to understand the trends and the patterns, and then to position the people around you to meet them. And that ability to see the big picture, identify those trends, that is super, super critical if you're going to be a really good risk manager. And I think that is more challenging in this day and age where we're just inundated with information overload all the time, being able to see that big picture.
Okay. No. And I just got a question. So should you put the questions in the chat or the Q&A? Either one, I'll monitor them. I'm just going to ask a few more questions, and then I'm going to actually use your questions. So don't worry, I'm coming to it. Maybe one or two more, not much more. So yeah, so the chat or the Q&A, you can send it to me or you can send it to everyone. It's whatever works best for you. But maybe just going back to Carol Ann, your comments, definitely, I couldn't agree with you more. Having a strategic mindset and working to add value, that is golden. So Carol Ann, Chief Risk Officer at Bank of Canada, that sounds great. So maybe tell us, and I know you must have worked hard to get there. So maybe give us a little insight on your career path and how your risk skills help you grow your career. You know, if you have any golden nuggets or pearls of wisdom for us, we could use it.
I mean, I don't know if anybody starts off and says, I'm going to be a risk manager. I think that might not be something most people are deciding when they're undergrad. But you know, I was an economist. And I still am an economist. And I spent most of my time, I came right into the Bank of Canada, right out of school, financial economics. And I spent maybe the first, let's say, 15 years of my career really building a deep understanding of what I would call the micro side of risk management. So really thinking about metrics, models. My expertise was around financial systems and financial institutions. If folks are on the line who are old enough to remember the financial crisis, there was a lot of work done in those times to really understand capital and banks, credit and market risk, systemic risk. And it was really quite detailed and it was really quite specific. And as I kind of went through, I was lucky enough to be involved in international policymaking for Basel III, but then also for the similar document for financial market infrastructures to really set up those principles for good risk management in these different spaces. And it was still quite specific. It was still quite detailed. And what was exciting about that time is we really felt that we were setting up good rules of the game that would hopefully minimize future crises. But we also kind of knew that we're probably setting the seeds for the next crisis. And it's all about behavior and the incentives around behavior. So this whole journey for me was really around understanding risk, I would say at a more micro level, very specific kinds of risk, liquidity risk, credit risk, market risk. At a certain point, as Basel III, the first version of Basel III was kind of coming together, I kind of had a sense that I had done this and it would be quite interesting to implement them and to understand from a real perspective what were the issues with these international, rules, and understand how the challenges they could be there. So I moved from being regulator to moving to Payments Canada, which owns and operates Canada's large value transfer system. And I became their first CRO to really implement some of these changes. And what was interesting about that transition, and this is where Schulich kind of comes in, is I thought I knew risk management because I had spent 15 years at the central bank talking about systemic risk and talking about micro and macro risks around the financial sector. And I had what I thought was a very clear framework for understanding risks. But it's different when you're a CRO. This whole push around what was really exciting, I kind of felt like, and actually, I should tell this story. Because before I left the Bank of Canada, I was actually the person responsible for supervising the financial market infrastructures, including Payments Canada. And so after I was finished my job, I talked to the CROs of one of those FMIs who I had regulated, who I had overseen. And I said to him, you know what? I'm going to go do this. He kind of laughed. He thought this was quite funny. And I said, what do I need to know? And his response was, it's nothing like you think it is on the other side. And you need to really think hard about what it means to do risk management because it's different than you think. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because I've spent several years telling him how to do it. But I did. I said, I'm going to take this seriously. And I signed up for Schulich's Enterprise Risk Management program. And what was really great about that program is it lifted me out of the details and really pushed this idea that was profoundly important about that strategic lens, like everything I'm saying now about the strategic lens and around seeing the big picture and about providing value. It's hard to say where it started, but I really do feel that the Schulich conversation was really where I saw enterprise risk as a more holistic thing than I had in the past, and more than just a silo credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk. And so that was a huge part of my journey. And so that was great at Payments Canada. And then I came back to the bank. And what's been really interesting through this whole journey is the focus on operational risk, which has kind of come to the fore. I kind of thought financial risks were challenging. They're pretty easy, actually. they're pretty easy to figure out. Operational risks are much more challenging. So that's where I am now, grappling with things like cyber and third-party risk management. So it's a bit of my career journey, and how Schulich played a pretty big role in it, actually.
So it's a great endorsement. Thank you
Yeah, it was
very
good.
much.
I've
Really,
sent many people to you, Carmen. You've
I
had
know a lot of the people that work for you. We appreciate it.
there's
So
people on this. There's a lot of people on this line who's come through, because I do think,
excellent. Never too many though. So here we go. So I'm going to take the first question from the audience. So we've been at it for about half an hour. So it's time to open it up to a question. And this one kind of follows on very nicely to what you were saying, Caroline, in terms of your career and your journey. So here you are now. So what were the risk management challenges for you in the crisis? And then what went well, and what lessons did you learn? This has been an incredible time.
yeah, no, it was pretty cool, actually. You know, if you're a risk manager, you nothing better than a good crisis to get you going. So I would say the Bank of Canada, I mean, everybody on this line should know who we are and what we do, but as Canada's central bank, you know, there was a pretty big piece of this puzzle that we were focused on from a business, which for us is policy perspective. So there's the monetary policy side, but then there was the financial system side. So just to set the scene a little bit, early in the crisis, we saw that there were financial system pressures pretty quickly. And the bank, from a policy perspective, took some pretty significant actions very, very quickly to enable the Canadian financial system to operate. And I'm not going to go into all the details about that, but here's what it meant on the inside for us is we had to create a whole bunch of new tools and operations that we hadn't done before. New purchase programs that required setting up new auctions, setting up new ways of doing transactions. So from an operational perspective, it was very fast and very challenging, and it hit multiple parts of the bank at the exact same time. And these parts of the bank are used to collaborating, but it's not necessarily on the speed with which we had to do it. And you talk about inherent risk versus residual risk. The inherent risk went through the roof because the Bank of Canada was putting these programs in place to support the Canadian financial system. Well, what if we couldn't do what it is we said we were going to do? So from a Canadian national perspective, the inherent risk kind of shot all the way up. And so we were really focused on how it was an operational risk focus right off the bat. How do you operationalize these? You have to design them. You have to put in infrastructure. You have to test them. You have to exercise them. You have to make sure they're actually going to function. And so that was the big challenge for us, and from a business perspective. And then we can talk about the people perspective, people actually doing their jobs from home. And what worked really well, what was quite exciting about the whole thing was we're a relatively small organization, and there is a culture of risk management. Now, when I say that, I mean that there's a culture of asking, of collaborating and pulling in people from other areas, and a belief that we need to set things up in good ways. And so we had to very quickly put together processes to enable us to design and implement and test these things. And the lesson learned is almost the same, in the sense that what would have made that, we did it. There were no big incidents. What would have made it better is if we'd had maybe one or two of these communication structures set up ahead of time, right? So from an operational perspective, if we kind of had some of this really fully baked ahead of time, wouldn't that have been nice? So what we're thinking about now is, from a business continuity perspective, what else do we need to do? What else do we need to think about? And what do we need to start planning for now? So that was just kind of a little peek under the hood of what was going on at the bank, while we were also transitioning to work from home, which we did very quickly.
When it rains, it pours, right? So that's the lesson in management. Things don't happen in isolation. It's not just one thing that's going to happen. It's going to be a few things that happen. That's what Makes it challenging, but also interesting. So I've noticed there are a few questions on the board and board oversight and any changes. Did they ask for anything? There was any reporting. There are a few questions. So I'm just kind of rolling them all into board.
Okay, through the crisis, I don't see the question. So when you say
Yeah. So
board,
through the crisis, did the board ask you for anything different, or it's just, you know, the same and the way they met was different, but
so I would say I don't think the board asked for anything different. I think the board, but maybe that's because we brought them very different things, and I think it really is on management to really be thinking about what the board needs and to bring them what they need. So we did change, and it was a real challenge to switch from in-person to online. And I think if I say one of the challenging things in that moment was you didn't have the time that you would normally have had to talk through what were some pretty challenging risks. And so you had to find ways to have those conversations and to make sure the board was fully aware and really understanding what was happening when all of a sudden, your way of communicating is much more challenging. So I would say that was the biggest challenge with the board. We talked about different kinds of things with the board. So you have, I'm sure everybody out there, they go to the board, they have their normal things they talk about in the normal way they do it. But when it comes to a crisis, all that kind of gets set aside because the issues are very different very quickly. So we had to be bringing very different things forward and educating the board on things that they wouldn't normally have known. And maybe this might be more of a Bank of Canada thing, but because at the Bank of Canada, we have a really interesting mandate. So in normal times, we take on almost no risk. We are very conservative, but our whole mandate is predicated on the fact that we are there when things go south. So in times of crisis, the Bank of Canada steps in to do these things. So in normal times, we have very little risk. And in times of extraordinary times, our risk, amounts of risk we take on by definition has to expand to meet our mandate. And so for the board, we had to very quickly educate them on a world they had never seen and a world they had not experienced, and risks that are normally almost zero now actually have a value attached to them. So I think that was for us really working hard to think ahead about what the board needed. And I think you're a good CRO and you're a good management team if you can really be thinking about what the board needs to understand.
And then another question we got is about the strategic mindset. If you could maybe define it, expand on it, any tips on how to grow, which is a good question. So let's see how you answer that one.
How do you grow it? So, I think this goes along with the value question. How are you providing value? So I'm gonna put this in the terms of, as a CRO, it can be very easy as a risk manager to fall into the trap of no. I think and Sheila, like you called it being the cop when I was there. It's very, very easy. But what you really need to do is be very thoughtful and probing with the business about what they need to achieve. So they show up and they say, we need to do this. And it's an easy reaction to say yes or no based on the risk appetite, right? Can't do that, But the strategic mindset is about asking why. Why do you want to do that? And they'll say, well, because of this. It's like, no, but really, what are you trying to achieve? And sometimes you have to ask 3 or 4 times to get them to articulate what they're trying to achieve. Because once they articulate what they're trying to achieve, it's about, okay, so the thing you suggested, that's a hard no because of all these risks. But what you want to achieve is this. And let's bring in people to talk about how you can achieve that in a way that actually is optimal from a risk perspective, because then you're better off, right? Because you're not going to have these risks to deal with. And when it comes to, if you have that strategic mindset in place, which to me is kind of like a yes and mentality, you're going to pull from the first line what they need, not what they think they want. And that's where the value and the influence really flies, for sure. So, as a CRO, you have to know that you are there. We all know whole point of risk is to help the business achieve their mandate, right? That's why we're there. We're to help them achieve it. And sometimes it's hard to convince the first line of that. But that's the strategic outlook you have to have as you kind of go forward. I don't know if that answered the person's question, but that's one of the many ways I think about it.
I think it's a great answer. And I'm a strong believer in strategy and asking why and having some clarity in terms of where you're going and what you're trying to achieve. Many people just kind of say, well, it's implicit, we kind of know, but why not make it explicit and talk about it? And then maybe you'll realize that it's not so clear. And then you can have some consensus and have a great conversation, because the value of this is the conversation. So being able to talk about it.
Yeah, and I remember this really funny conversation I had with a COO in a past life, and it's kind of he didn't really buy enterprise risk management. Didn't really, I was on the executive team, but he wasn't quite sure he bought it. Right? He's like, yeah, we need a CRO. Regulations say so, therefore you're here. And I'm kind of explaining it, and he looks at me. He's like, well, that's just good management, right? So the thing that risk brings to the table is pushing this diversity of ideas, the debate, the dialogue, thinking through different options, looking for the opportunities, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, but that's just good management. I went, yes, it is just good management, but that doesn't actually happen naturally in most places. You kind of need someone, just like you need a COO sitting there thinking about the operations, you need someone with a risk lens thinking about it from that opportunities and downsides to be able to bring that to the conversations, but having those different views around the table. And it's kind of like, oh, okay, I guess I do need all those different pieces to the puzzle. So anyway, it was quite an interesting conversation.
No, that's great insight. And monitoring the questions, and I'm trying to group them again. There are a number of them on culture. So they're very interested in terms of what you've done on culture. How do you define culture? I know it's the soft, fuzzy things. And in my mind, culture is always, like, what do people do when you're not watching them? So it's inside of them. So take it away, Carol Ann.
So culture. I see one, actually, this has got to be Penny. I see Penny Lynn, but that's got to be Penny Lynn McPherson. Hi, Penny. Hey, Penny Lynn. I've worked with her in the past. She's fantastic. So she's got one here on culture. So I'm just going to grab that. So I have something to go for. So how do you bring the organization along on that journey? And so culture, oh man, it's a big question for everyone, because I don't know, what's that quote? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think there's a Peter Drucker quote, something in that space. And it absolutely is the case. So you need a whole bunch of things to enable culture, and it's not fast. It has to be insidious. So you do need the top down, you need the tone from the top. So you need people demanding that risk is important. And what that means is not having a policy that says risk is important. It means everyone at the top asking, where is risk at the table? So, if the CEO if there's a big strategy meeting, tone from the top means saying, we're having this discussion, but I don't see the CRO at the table. It means if you're, the manager of a department and you're going to make a decision, it's about saying, I don't see where are my risk folks at the table. So at every level of the organization, the leaders have to be asking for those points of view at the table. That's how you show tone from the top. There's no other way to do it. You can reward performance as well, but that's only bilateral. You really need to have both that bilateral, but then also that requirement that they're important in the conversation. So they have to have the tone from the top. And then you have to build it from the bottom up as well. And I think part of this goes to, how does one think about risk management? And I think it's a really hard slog if people think about risk management as being no, compliance, follow the rules, because you're not then helping them see the true value of risk management, just seeing both sides of the puzzle. So you have to kind of have the top down, and then you have to have the bottom up, where you are instilling in your risk managers that their job is to understand what's happening, you know, understand what the business needs and help them find solutions to it. And that's all done with a tension, of course, of you can't just roll over and do what the business wants. But that's a very hard tension. And I think as people move through an organization, become more senior in risk management, the people who become more senior and who are successful are the ones who can balance that tension between being challenging, because you need to be challenging, but then also helping define the value and enable the business. And you really just need buy-in across a whole organization to develop the culture. And you just have to model it constantly. And your team has to model it constantly by asking for diversity of ideas. So, I mean, that's just a snippet on culture, the piece.
Okay, one more question here. So you mentioned that, and I always say that too, like risk management is a core competency. It's just like project management and time management. How can you not go through life or have a career without understanding risk management? So it's a basic skill. So do you see a growing need for risk management skills for risk managers in the organizations and others?
Well, I mean, it seems to be a very popular skill set. If you're looking for a job, I see risk management jobs everywhere. So it seems to be absolutely a growth industry. And I think people are looking for ways to help them manage through an ever-changing environment. So I think it absolutely is a fact that it is a growth industry, and people are looking for that approach. I like to think about, you know, the most important things. I see the same thing over and over again: diversity of ideas, debate, and dialogue. So for me, if you kind of get that, you're going to get the basis of good risk management, because you have to be forward thinking. And so this is really a core competency that you want across the first, second, and third line, where people are looking for different points of view, where people are actually challenging, and where people are growing and learning as they go and looking for those optimal solutions. You want that. It's a competency as opposed to a hard skill that you want to grow across the three lines of defense, not just in a risk management title, right? It's about the uncertainty around future events, that you just want people to be thinking about the uncertainty around future events and what that could mean on both sides. So I think that's the soft skill. But from the perspective of job titles, man, it does seem to be very hot topic, and we're grappling with some very specific things, like the cyber, like operational resilience and third party, etc.
Okay, well, Carol Ann, thank you so much. That brings us at about 45 minutes, which we would said we would do. So you've been a just superb first speaker. Thank you so much. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but we will try to get back to you and follow. We appreciate the great attendance. And maybe just to let you know, we're gonna take a little break for the summer, because it's summer, right? But our next webinar is Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And we're going to be talking about the new risk management book that's just been published on enterprise risk management. This is the second edition. We've been using the first edition in our program for past 10 years. And it's a great book, but it did need a refresh. So now we're going to talk with the authors about the second edition. So we're going to have Rob Quayle, who's one of the instructors in our program. We're going to have John Fraser, who's the former Chief Risk Officer at Hydro One, and the one that helped me 10 years ago start the program at Schulich. And we're also going to have Betty Simpkins, the third author from the Oklahoma State University. So please join us on Wednesday, August 11th at 2 o'clock. And in the meantime, enjoy your summer, and thank you again, Carol Ann.
Thanks, Carmen.